Thanks for joining us, Doug.
Sure, happy to be here.
Great. I'm so happy that you are returning on Crashing the War Party. The first thing I wanted to ask you was about the cluster munitions that are being sent by the U.S. to Ukraine. It's been big news this week. What do you think of these weapons? And more importantly, the idea that they are being sent because the U.S. is running low in its own stockpiles of artillery shells?
Well, I think the key word right now to understand what's happening in Ukraine and why people are behaving as they are in Washington and London and other places is desperation. Frankly, everyone is now pushing out of the door whatever they've got in the direction of Kyiv in the hope that it will somehow or another help rescue Ukraine from inevitable defeat. And it's kind of interesting to watch because just 3, 4, 5 months ago, when we and I was by no means the only one, said, look, this has no chance of success. Ukraine is doomed. Everyone sort of poured filth and abuse all over us. Now, privately, everyone is saying, oh, you're right, it can't happen. It's not going to work. The cluster munitions themselves are unattractive for a whole range of reasons. First of all, they produce a lot of duds. That means there are lots of people that are going to end up being harmed by these things long after they've been shot. I certainly saw that in 1991. It was such an annoyance for us that we actually asked the artillery to stop using the munitions because it didn't bother us in tanks and armored fighting vehicles, but everyone who was in a wheeled vehicle, trucks, Humvees, and so forth behind us were taking losses. The equipment was being harmed, or in some cases, people were being harmed. And then after the war, of course, we did have Iraqi children that were brought to us who picked these things up and thought they were something else. So we thought after the war was over that this would probably go away. It just wasn't worth the trouble. And high explosive warheads were much better. And in addition, we now have today a degree of precision that far exceeds what we had in 91. Which means that you don't have to shoot something with lots of munitions that are designed to be area weapons in the hopes that you're going to hit something. You can actually hit what you shoot at. So I think this is just desperation on the part of the administration. The bad news is, of course, it makes us look once again like shameless hypocrites.
Yeah. Well, what about what's going on the battlefield today? I feel like there was a lot of talk about the Ukraine counteroffensive up until like late last month. And is it a media distortion field in which we can't really discern whether or not this counteroffensive is actually working? Is it failing? What is your sense and what are you reading behind the scenes about what the conditions are on the ground? Or are we just pouring tons of U.S. and Western aid into a sieve there? It's hard for Americans just, kind of dipping into this story to discern what's going on.
Well, I love that term, distortion field. I'm going to employ that now ad nauseum, and I'll try to endnote you when I do that. But the bottom line is we've been living in that field now for over a year. The so-called counteroffensive was a complete and utter disaster. We think the Ukrainians lost between 15 and 20,000 soldiers killed. And once again, when this began, or was at least discussed, we tried to make the point that if you look at the defensive structure, the 15 to 25 kilometer security zone in front of the main defensive belts, you understand the links between overhead intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, and various strike systems, conventional artillery, rockets, tactical ballistic missiles, so-called drones. It was very obvious that these people had no chance of getting through. They weren't going to get anywhere. They weren't sufficiently trained. And again, this goes back to the larger problem that certainly after the first few months, I would say by the middle of the summer, most of the soldiers in the Ukrainian army that were actually trained and had any experience at all were largely dead or wounded. And the Ukrainian army has never really recovered from those losses because you just don't make more officers, make more NCOs. I mean, by October of 1943, the German army had lost 55,000 officers. And if you look carefully at the situation after October 43, they really weren't capable of very much offensive action because they just didn't have the experience. So I think right now the lesson of this Ukraine debacle is you can't build effective armed forces on the fly. And again, Americans don't understand that, flesh and blood is always, an unavoidable consequence of going to war. War is a matter of flesh and blood, but it's also a function of organization, a structure, leadership, culture, discipline, all of these things. And you build these institutions over time. So the whole thing was deeply flawed, but you've got a lot of people on the Hill that still believe that throwing money at something, shoving technology at something is going to create military power. They do it here in the United States. It doesn't work. It never has. And so Ukraine is now, I think, in the worst position it's been from the very beginning. I don't think it has very much left. Somebody said the other day they may have 10 to 20 brigades. Of course, what are we talking about? 2,000 men per brigade, or 20, 25,000, 30,000? They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Their press gangs are operating all over the country, particularly now in the West, to try and force people into the Ukrainian military. They're meeting with real opposition and resistance wherever they go. The trains in Germany are arriving every day with Ukrainian refugees, and many of these cars are filled with young men. I mean, the notion that this is in any way, shape, or form a success for the people of Ukraine is disastrous. We haven't even talked about the millions that have left. So the bottom line is the counteroffensive is over. It was dead on arrival, never had a chance. And now we have people in Vilnius talking about reducing the two-step process for membership of Ukraine and NATO to one. And if they go ahead with this, that will guarantee the eventual arrival of Russian troops on the Polish border, because the Russians will simply conclude they can never have a reliably neutral Ukrainian state on their border. They'll think that whatever happens, it will always be subverted with the idea of somehow or another pushing NATO missiles, American missiles, and American capabilities further east. They can't accept that.
I do want to talk about NATO, but I had one more question. I don't know if you saw that Newsweek article by Bill Arkin a week or two ago about the CIA operations in Ukraine, and the thrust of the piece was more about, the process of gathering information and surveillance under a tricky situation of not being technically an ally of Ukraine and not technically at war with Moscow, and how the CIA is doing all this. But one of the interesting pieces of the article was that there are about 100 CIA officers, supposedly, according to this article and his reporting, in Ukraine today. That's no surprise. We've been hearing about this and the CIA presence there for some time now. We also got some idea from those Discord leaks that there are probably a dozen U.S. special forces in the country as well, though that wasn't included in Arkin's piece. There was that bombing at the cafe in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and there had been some speculation that there had been some, at least American volunteers killed, maybe even U.S. special forces. I think the American people deserve some clarity on this. Do you have any sense or thoughts about the reality of whether or not the United States has some military presence on the ground there that's not being revealed to the American public?
Well, actually, I must have missed that Arkin piece, but then again, Arkin is such a neocon that I really don't pay too much attention to what the man publishes. He's on the opposite team. He wants this war to continue.
Yeah.
When it comes to what have we actually got on the ground over there, I'm sure 100 is a gross underestimate. I think there are hundreds of U.S. military in various forms, intelligence and otherwise. We know that some headquarters have been struck and destroyed that probably resulted in the deaths of, they say, NATO officers, undoubtedly some Americans. All of this has been carefully concealed and kept quiet. We've been down this road before. We went through this before the intervention in Vietnam began in '65, when we had people being shot and killed in Vietnam. We've had people all over the world for decades operating in clandestine settings. So that's not really a surprise. What people need to understand is that the Russians know Ukraine, just as the Ukrainians know Russians. There's nothing happening in Ukraine that the Russians don't know. There are probably tens of thousands of Russian sympathizers all over the place, and they report constantly. I mean, this is part of the paranoia that affects the Zelensky regime. They're constantly sending out the secret police to arrest people, brutalize people, shoot people, whatever is necessary, because they know their every move is carefully watched. I mean, President Putin was talking recently about so-called decision-making centers. The question had come up several times over the last several months. Do we hit the so-called decision-making centers? We call that command and control centers in the American military. They know where they are. I mean, Zelensky's walking around and breathing because the Russians have decided to let him do so. I'm sorry, but those are the facts. What are we learning? What are we finding out? Well, we're finding out the truth, and we're not reporting it. Because if the intelligence agents who are down on the ground were allowed to really tell the truth, well, we'd pack our bags and get out and make peace. This is time for peace. This is insane. The killing needs to end. It's accomplishing nothing. And, the longer this goes on, the more likely we are finally to see the much ballyhooed but not yet witnessed Russian offensive, which will push across the rest of eastern Ukraine. And if necessary, they'll go all the way to the border. There's a lot of pressure on Putin to mobilize the nation because the Russian media says, not inaccurately, we're not at war with the Ukrainians, we're at war with NATO and the United States. So let's stop the pretense, drop it. Let's mobilize and get this over with. This is part of the Prigozhin issue. Prigozhin's attitude, was always that we're not doing enough. We're too slow, too deliberate. The generals don't have fire in the belly, as they call it. That was his message. That was really one of the reasons he did what he did. I think a lot of people in Russia agree with him. That's why this is a good time to end it. But we're making it worse by what's happening in Vilnius right now. We're obstructing the path to some sort of ceasefire that would allow us to come to an arrangement, whether we all like it or not. But we need to stop the killing.
Thanks for coming on the show. It's good to see you again. Speaking of a ceasefire, speaking of how to change policy to try to bring this to a conclusion, how concerned are you that things might end up going the other way, that the U.S. or some of its allies would then try direct intervention in the event of more Ukrainian defeats, that there would be an attempt to try to bail them out through direct intervention?
Well, that's always been my concern ever since we listened to David Petraeus talk about a coalition of the willing that could go in. Of course, he's also the same man that predicted a resounding success and victory for the Ukrainians and gave his usual description of warfare a la 1942 to explain it, which makes no sense at all today. So I think it's a real problem. Right now, what I've been hearing, and I'm interested to know what comes out of the meeting in Vilnius, is that the Poles and Lithuanians are talking about some sort of joint intervention. And that strikes me as complete lunacy, but they seem to think that they can do it. I think they've been drinking their own bathwater. The big lies, Russians aren't that good. Russians can't do this, can't do that, even though the chief of staff of the Polish army has warned them that the Russian troops are excellent and we should not underestimate them. But nevertheless, there's talk about going into Western Ukraine. Now, these people, remember, also have unfulfilled agendas. These are people in Eastern Europe that are still unhappy about the consequences of 2 world wars. They're looking backward in history. They don't like the Russians, and they think they should be running the show in Eastern Europe. And as I told one just the other day on a similar podcast, well, if you feel strongly about that, you should get out of NATO. Because if you try to go in to Western Ukraine and pretend that you are somehow or another operating independently of NATO, the Russians won't buy it. They will view you as a Trojan horse for NATO. So if that's what you want to do, you need to walk away from the alliance, because I can tell you the rest of the alliance will not go with you. That's not going to happen. Now, I don't know what we would tell our troops on the ground in Poland or Romania to do, I worry that foolishly we might tell them to go in and support them because we don't have the ammunition on hand. We don't have the supplies. We don't have the developed logistical infrastructure. We don't have the staying power. We're not prepared to fight a major war. But, I suppose there's an outside chance that something stupid like that could occur. But in the meantime, how do you get it across to these people in Poland and Lithuania that you have an agenda? That's yours. That's not NATO's. That's not an agenda in Washington, or it shouldn't be. And if you do this, you're going to end up regretting it because the Russians will view that as an unambiguous NATO threat, and they will strike. And they're probably going to strike in Lithuania and Poland. And that would be, in my judgment, catastrophic.
Yeah, well, because at that point you would have all of the people braying for a wider war. Some of them have already been praying for it, and would then have the pretext for that they've been wanting. Looking at U.S. policy, NATO policy in this war, it seems unlikely that it's going to change anytime soon. But what would need to change, in your view, to bring this to a conclusion, to establish some kind of ceasefire?
Well, first, keep in mind that our friend Scholz in Berlin is on very thin ice. He's about as popular as Macron. I think his numbers are down around 33% approval rating. The situation, in France is obvious. It's catastrophic. So those are two of the large military powers in NATO. I don't see the Swedes, the Danes, and the Dutch mobilizing and marching east. I don't see any interest in Austria, which is not in NATO, but is part of the EU. The Hungarians have made it clear what they will and will not accept. The Bulgarians have now stood up and said they're not going to sign on for this deal with Ukraine in NATO. They had massive demonstrations. The populations in Romania do not want this. They're not interested in going to war. So you have a globalist elite that is really looking at this Ukrainian patient, which is almost comatose, and they're trying to give it a haircut and a shave and say, let's go, and we'll rescue humanity. It's not going to work. So even if the globalist elite say, we must respond, it's not going to happen in Europe. The Europeans will not support this. You saw what happened in the Netherlands. That's one brick out of the edifice. We're going to see more of that in the future. The problems in Europe are far more grievous than anything happening in Eastern Europe. And that's something the Europeans know. It's something that I think a lot of us in the United States know. We've got far, far more important things here to deal with than in Europe. But the globalist elites want to continue this, and they're going to do everything in their power to sustain it. I just don't think it can happen. So if the Poles and Lithuanians are foolish and go in there, and we would be very stupid to let them do it, they're not going to get the kind of support that perhaps they think in the backs of their minds they will get. So now, do you want a ceasefire? Washington can produce that instantly. All Washington has to do is send a note to Moscow and say, we are now withdrawing all of our personnel from Ukraine, because they know that we have people on the ground over there. Everybody, all Americans, come out. Secondly, we are now suspending any further aid in any form to Ukraine. Number two. At that point, the Russians would meet and talk. But short of that, there will be no talks because there's no reason for them to believe us in anything we say. So those two things would have to happen immediately. And I think if we did that, we would then have to call the British back to barracks and say enough's enough. The rest of the Europeans won't be an issue, in my judgment.
Doug, do you see any tension in Washington and in the administration in terms of which way to go on this, a diplomatic path, or continue the road to war? Or is everyone on the Blinken, Victoria Nuland bandwagon, which seems to be headed towards some sort of like idyllic regime change policy that we all know is never going to work, but they seem like hurtling towards that conclusion? Do you think there are any elements in the Biden administration that might be saying, maybe it's time to talk?
Well, as a general observation, remember that we have government by donor, and most of the donors are behind the Newland-Blinken insanity. That's number one. Number two, sure, there are people in the White House right now on the staff that have said, look, this isn't going well. We don't want this happening next year during an election campaign. We need to find a way to bring this to closure. There are people like that. You have people, I think, on the Hill privately behind the scenes that are more sober-minded than Lindsey Graham or Chuck Schumer or any of those people. But in the meantime, in addition to the donor problem, you have this combination of what I call arrogance and ignorance. A lot of these people have never known what they were dealing with from day one. Go back and look at the initial assumptions. Well, once we go in there and the Russians realize the sanctions are biting, the Russian economy will collapse. Their currency will go under. They'll have no choice but to deal with us. By the way, their military is weak. They're incompetent. They can't do anything. None of that made any sense. It didn't take, it did not take stock of any of the realities of the Russian state, the Russian people, the Russian military. So here we sit, not quite 18 months later, but close. And we're staring at an absolute catastrophe. Now, the interesting thing, and this is sad, but this is true, most Americans don't care. They're not watching what's happening. Ukraine might as well be somewhere in the Antarctic. That's the view for most Americans, which means that they're easily seduced by whatever Washington says. And as long as nothing happens to them, well, then what's the problem? I mean, this is the problem on the financial side with all the borrowing and the national sovereign debt, with the offshoring of jobs. We just go down the list. This is a huge problem. Americans are complacent because they don't feel the bite. The problem is that if this is not stopped, what occurs in Washington will be far worse than anybody imagines, because the collapse overseas of Ukraine will be something no one can conceal. And we will watch NATO disintegrate very rapidly. It's already on the verge of disintegration behind the scenes. People over there aren't stupid. They know what's coming, but they're unwilling to act because, again, they want to be on the good side of the United States. They want to remain tied to us because they're afraid. Well, they're about to figure out that being tied to us isn't going to make any difference if you're stupid. And the Ukrainians have been very stupid. The Poles are right up there with them, and now the Lithuanians. And I think that's going to sink in. And then Washington has another catastrophic failure on its hands. What will Americans say or do? Well, I can't imagine them being happy about it. And it will have consequences here. People don't seem to understand. The Russians can escalate horizontally. You don't like what's happening? Well, stand by. You may not like what's coming in Mexico, in the Caribbean basin. The Russians have a lot of influence and power. Well, you haven't heard much out of North Korea. That can change. North Korea has always been close to Moscow, not Beijing. That's a complete misnomer. The Chinese dislike North Korea intensely, but North Korea has been a very useful tool for Moscow. All they have to do is send it some new missile bodies, some new rocket engines, and the fools up in North Korea are prepared to do all sorts of things. Nobody is thinking like that.
No.
All of this can have a very negative impact here at home. So hopefully the people in the White House who are sober-minded and have concluded this is a failure will finally become ascendant. But right now they're not. They are just carping on the sidelines. And again, we got to go back to who are the big money people on the left? Who are the donors? What do they want? They're the ones sponsoring the people on the ground in Kyiv and also in Washington and New York City. They're driving the train, and in London.
Yep, that's a great point. And we've done a lot of work at Responsible Statecraft exposing a lot of the think tanks who have connections to defense contractors, and all of these reports and all of these op-eds and all of the messaging that you see in the media is brought to you by the defense industry via think tanks that are supposedly, academic institutions that are just framing the policy for the future. And so, there's a lot of shenanigans, and you're right. It all goes back to money and funding.
Well, remember, the people in the defense industries are in business. And their job is to take all the money they can get out of Washington and stuff it into their pockets. That's about it. And so everything is viewed by them as a wonderful opportunity. Although I suspect that somewhere in the sort of distant realm of CEO land, there are people now who are probably privately expressing concerns.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard any. That doesn't mean they haven't done it. But right now, the money is intoxicating. I mean, if you look at the billions that are flowing, and as we've talked about this before, and you know this, most of this cash doesn't go to Ukraine. It ends up being recycled through the washing machine right here into the pockets of most people in D.C. and elsewhere. So it's an old story, but it's dangerous now. And we don't even know what people would do in a real crisis. I mean, once you have tens of thousands of Russian troops moving west, they cross the Dnieper River and start moving to secure Odessa, and other columns are moving further west towards the Polish border. What kinds of insane things are we likely to do?
Yeah.
Well, we'll show those Russians, alert our nuclear force. Good luck with that. That's crazy. We don't want to go there. That's back to what Dan was saying. This could escalate very rapidly to much higher levels, not because we're strong, but because we're weak.
Well, you certainly don't sugarcoat anything. Doug, I'm going to excuse myself and jump out of the window.
Well, please don't do that.
Okay. I would love for you to come back on the show and have some better news for us. Maybe in a few months, 6 months from now. Let us only hope that things might go in a better direction. But I really appreciate you coming on the show with us today.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Dan.